Cosby has been found guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault against Andrea Constant. The jury just coming back, count 1, aggravated indecent assault without her consent while she was unconscious or unaware. That, of course, speaks to her claim that he had drugged her, that she was unable to really even know what was going on. Count 3, while she was intoxicated or drugged. Bill Cosby now faces a fine of up to $25,000 for each of the 3 counts, and each count carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. Lisa.
Well, it is a triumph for the prosecution, and they surely understood what Ron was speaking about earlier. This is an old case. It was a he said, she said case. The last time they tried, they ended in a mistrial. But this time, I think the difference was more women were able to tell their stories. And if you look back, as we were just discussing about the jury they looked at Cosby's old testimony. He admitted these behaviors had happened and had an excuse. The jury didn't buy that excuse.
Danny Ceballos.
I've handled cases in this courthouse in Norristown, and I can tell you that aggravated indecent assault, it means the jury found that there was an absence of consent, that she was impaired, and that she was unconscious. And in a case like this, the maximum may be 10 years, but realistically speaking, at sentencing, Bill Cosby's looking in the range of 22 months, somewhere around there. But the guidelines certainly call for incarceration. So the person that we once knew as America's dad will be heading into one of America's prisons, specifically a Pennsylvania State Correctional Facility, in all likelihood.
So you've been inside that courthouse before. Help us understand what happens next and the arguments that his side could make to reduce the maximum.
It's very unlikely that Bill Cosby would get the maximum in this case because he's what we call a zero in Pennsylvania. He's got no prior criminal record that's significant for sentencing purposes, at least as far as I know. So that, plus you can expect that his attorneys will put on a show about all of the goodwill and all of the charitable works that Bill Cosby has done over the years. They'll make the strongest argument for the absolute lowest end of the guidelines, which could fall below 22 months, given the Pennsylvania sentencing guidelines matrix. But in this case, in this courthouse, this is easily one of the biggest cases this courthouse has ever seen. It's in a leafy, somewhat suburban suburb of Philadelphia that I know very well, and this is a very, very big verdict for this part of Pennsylvania.
And a stunning, absolutely stunning turn for a man who was once one of the most beloved dads, probably in the history of television, a beloved comedian, incredibly rich and famous. It's one thing to take away a man's stand-up bookings, to take away his honorary degrees. It's another thing to take away his freedom. Let's go back to Ron Allen, who is outside the courthouse, and what are you seeing and hearing from there?
Well, Chris, there's a question now of what happens now. Cosby is free on bail, and we've been asking the district attorney what will happen if he is convicted. It's unclear whether the judge will revoke that bail, and if that happens, he could be on his way to jail almost immediately. There is the prosecution is likely to argue that Cosby is a flight risk. He has his own private plane. He can go anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world. So there is an argument for putting him right in jail. We don't know whether that will happen or not. His defense is obviously going to try to appeal this. They have said that, and they will try to do that almost immediately. And just to follow up what you were saying earlier, I think the big difference in this case was, in fact, the 5 additional accusers, the 5 women who came in and told their stories, and they sounded so much like the story that Andrea Constant was saying. In the summation, the prosecutor kept saying, "Sound familiar? Sound familiar?" Cosby had an MO. They called him a con. This was his con. He would befriend women, earn their trust, take them to his home, invite them to his home, mentor them, and at some point intoxicate them with alcohol, quaaludes, medications, drugs, in this case, Benadryl, and then take advantage of them. Young women. In one case, this happened when the woman was 17 years old. Another was in her 20s. These were young, aspiring starlets and models in Hollywood at a time when Cosby was one of the most powerful men in show business. And Andrea Constand's case, again, it was one of the perhaps you might want to say weaker cases, but it was the only one that the criminal justice system could handle because of what had happened. But there were a number of witnesses, and particularly one who alleged that Cosby raped her. So that is what the jury was listening to for 2 weeks. It was very passionate. It was very emotional. And in the summation, the DA, a young woman named Kristen Fedden, made a point at one point. Cosby was sort of smirking. He had a almost laughing, had a bemused look on his face. And she strode over to him and pointed her finger at him and said, "This is not funny, Mr. Cosby. He thinks it's funny. This is not funny." It was just an incredible moment in the courtroom. The courtroom was just aghast. And again, you have to believe that the jury just was so moved by the passion of these women.
And found
Cosby
them, Ron. I mean, because this was, as Lisa pointed out, this was about credibility. And this was not just about Andrea Constand's, I would argue, credibility. It was about the credibility, as you say, of this whole string of women who showed that there was a pattern here, who showed that the man that a lot of people thought they knew was, in fact, somebody very different when he wasn't on television. Legal analyst Katie Fang is on the phone with us. And I just want to ask you about, of course, as a matter of course, his legal team will immediately file appeal. But on what grounds is the question, number one, and what's the likelihood that, given now we're at a second trial, the jury came back very clearly about what they believe, what's the chances you see for an appeal here?
So there are material differences between the first trial that ended up with your hung jury last year and the second retrial. One of the biggest differences is the fact that there were 5 additional victims in addition to Andrea Constand that were permitted by Judge O'Neill to be able to testify about their similar experiences with Bill Cosby. As a result, that could be one of the substantive legal grounds for purposes of an appeal. In the meantime, Mr. Cosby's been out on bail. You do have to post what you call a supersedious bond, meaning you have to post a bond to ensure that you stay out of custody while an appeal is pending, if that's where they go. But another major difference is you heard about the $3.4 million settlement, and that was another big difference. And so there's a few things that could be grounds for an appeal. We'll see whether or not he does it. If he does, I mean, listen, he's 80 years old. Even just sentencing on one of those counts could be literally he comes out of prison in a body bag because he dies in prison. So it's going to be an important thing to see whether or not they fight hard to keep him out of custody.
Lisa, what do you see happening next?
Well, I mean, one hesitates to draw very large conclusions from a single case, but how can you not? This is a verdict in the post-Weinstein era. I think this will ennoble and enable a lot of women to feel like their voices can be heard. I think it's a rebuke, perhaps, to the prosecution's attempt to really dust up and damage the credibility of the women who spoke. They were really, really harsh, and it just didn't work.
I want to get final thoughts, if I can, from Danny Savalos. What do you see happening next?
I think we're going to see an appeal, not immediately. Procedurally, that's going to come shortly. But there are appealable issues in this case. The fact that 5 additional women, more than last year, in which the judge allowed one woman to testify about what we attorneys call prior bad acts, that is a very, very contested issue, and it's an appealable issue, and I think it's one that Cosby, it'll probably be the chief issue on appeal, that among many others that his defense attorneys will raise. But we will see what he raises in his appeal, but we will also see a lot at sentencing. We will see a real show where the attorneys demonstrate to the judge that this is a man for whom the sentencing guidelines, the judge should go below the sentencing guidelines and to the maximum extent possible, the minimum amount of